All right, folks, welcome. Today we're continuing Platt's Imperial Twilight, talking about 17th or 18th and 19th century China-British relations and lead up to the Opium War. And actually today we talk about kind of the end of the Golden Age. If you didn't do the reading yet, you might not know why it's the end of the Golden Age. If you hear my background fan, that's my air conditioner on fan. I'm hoping it doesn't crash my computer again. And by crash, I mean just it turned the circuit breaker off. Oops. So we'll see if that happens again today. I'll probably end up going to air conditioner if I get too hot. All right, but today we're going to keep going with Platt. Let me get my book. Here we go, and my notes. Yeah. All right, so we ended somewhere around here. Let me open it. We were talking about the Qing situation and the suppression of rebels. So we already did most of this. Let's see how far we got. Oh, yeah. We got somewhere to the corruption, right? The Hessian, we did a little bit of Hessian, right? Does everybody agree? I think we got about here. Somebody can check if it seems correct. That seems correct to me. Yeah. Somebody in the chat is a utilitarian. Nice. A couple of utilitarians. Everybody says yes. That's where we were. Great. I won't get too much into utilitarians yet. They'll come up though. Why? You'll see. Somebody in our chat made a very similar argument to ones we'll see in our class in a couple weeks. So, some kind of argument like do not trading opium did harm to them. There's a limit to the harm argument. Yeah, we talked about Hessian was absurdly wealthy. Yeah. Now, to get in the detail here, it's actually super intense. Now, we did talk about the abdication of the emperor, too. We talked about how this is the longest reigning emperor in Chinese history. And most of his reign was the best. Right? It was like the high point of Chinese society. Qianlong's reign was a huge reign and considered successful. However, by the end, he kind of messed it up. Now, he abdicated to one of his sons, Qing, in 1796, but he didn't actually resign. He just did it to make his grandfather look good, and then he stayed in power basically and tried to persecute the war, and he basically had dementia. It looks like probably early onset Alzheimer's. As it mentions, a Korean emissary pointed out that the former emperor, kind of forgot what he ate for breakfast and didn't remember the things they talked about in the morning. So yeah, telltale sign of issues. Now, we learn a little bit more about Hessian here. Not only was he famously corrupt, but it kind of shows you why the emperor, even though he was, Qianlong was one of the greater emperors, he still made mistakes. And one of the mistakes was ever promoting Hessian. Now, Hessian basically took over the government by the end. And this included sending false military reports to the former emperor, the retired emperor who was running everything, who was himself a famous, successful general. So he was super confused, like, why is the war over and why is it costing all my money? Somebody asked a good question that I'll interrupt for. What language do you think the Chinese and Koreans spoke to each other during the meetings? Well, Chinese, obviously. Now, why would I say obviously? Because until the 20th century, the average literate Korean, the average literate Japanese, and the average literate Chinese all read and wrote the same language, and they could speak it to some approximation of Chinese. Koreans generally were better at it because they lived closer to China, right, and had more interaction with China. And in this period, the Koreans were actually vassals of China, so they had a much more constant interaction. The Japanese could speak it, but the pronunciation was, let's just say it was more of like a rural dialect. But everybody was basically speaking Chinese. That's an interesting and good question. But yeah, the corruption levels were staggering. I reread this morning just to kind of get... So basically the regular soldiers were off fighting a different battle. When I said Chinese, I do mean Mandarin, yes. Cantonese is the southern dialect. The imperial government did not use Cantonese. So in the south, the army was actually off doing like work, and they thought the emperor, with his false reports, thought the language wasn't bad. Somebody said the Koreans used Chinese characters until the 1400s when they developed their own written language. Okay. Remember we talked about how everything in Asia is political? That is one of those many political things. So, just because they had a homebrewed written system, which is Hangul, does not mean they used Hangul for a majority of things. Basically, until 1945, Koreans used majority Chinese script. And then, post World War II, well, yeah, but the political controversy of what language is using is basically part of our story. It'll come up when we get to Korea. But, so the Koreans used Chinese characters fully until 1945, and then post Japanese occupation, they switched to Hangul exclusively. Although that's, if you dig a little deeper, you'll notice that the Korean society still uses a lot of Chinese. For example, almost every Korean has their name in Chinese. All the historical documents before 1945, every historical building, right, all the script is in Chinese. So at some point, even in Korea, you have to have at least a familiarity with Chinese, because they had Sino-Korean, which was, it's just Chinese Korean, and that was the majority official language for Korea for most of its history. And somebody points out, yeah, that someone's mom was Korean, and they have to recognize Chinese characters. Yes, but it's heavily political, so again, that's why we'll get to there, but let's stick to China, because all these histories are super political. But at this time, they did in fact speak Chinese to each other, at least a good approximation of it. Now, this corruption at all levels is staggeringly bad. Like, it's so bad that the locals who in the South, who were trying to fight the White Lotus Rebellion, started calling the government forces the Red Lotus, because they were just like robbing and stealing as much as the rebels were. So, this war kept going. Now, and how bad was it? Where is this here? The total cost of the war was 100 million taels of silver. Now, you might not know how much 100 million taels of silver are, but it's something like 2 years of the entire imperial revenue. So going into this war, the emperor was rich, the empire was profitable, and even though there was a lot of corruption, the treasury was full, and, the army was strong. They'd beaten every domestic opponent, and they'd expanded the borders, they'd beaten local tribes, they were feeling pretty good. And then, by the death of the emperor, this is only a couple of years, like 5 years, the empire's basically broke. The whole center of the empire is in a massive civil war that hasn't been won. There's high levels of corruption, and, the Europeans are poking at the borders, right? This is not a good situation for the Qing. So it's starting that degradation cycle. So it goes from this pinnacle of richness and literary talent and confidence. Remember that chapter 1, man, in the McCartney mission? That's in the 1790s. So that's the same period as rebellion. That was 1793. So by 1796, 1797 to 1798, the government's broke. There's a giant rebellion, etc. Somebody says, oh, I knew, that's why Stanton wrote his name in Chinese. Exactly. So Koreans still have Chinese versions of their names, but you don't use them all the time, but they know them. Does that make sense? So all of even modern Korean has Chinese, a way you could write it that's Sino-Korean, right? Japanese is the same way. Everything in Japanese you could write without katakana. You could. Just because we don't doesn't mean you couldn't. It's just it's like us studying Shakespeare, right? It's an older language that we refer to, and you're supposed to learn as an educated person, but you may or may not know it depending on your education. That's basically what that is. So, again, heavily politicized. We'll get into the politics. But again, one reason it is, at this period, right before the Qing starts declining, China was so rich and powerful, everybody at least acknowledged, wow, China's rich and powerful. Like, even if you didn't want, like, the Koreans are very proud people. They did not see themselves as under the Qing. But they kept an eye on it. And like, hey, we'll take your free stuff. That's fine. So, but this is when the beginning of the end starts. Now, the end does take 115 years. It takes a while. But this is where the start begins. This heavy corruption and just bankrupting of the government by just pure greed of the administration. So, welcome to the beginning of the end. All right. Any questions so far about the Qing situation? Let's try to keep it on topic. We're already a little bit behind. But the character questions are quite interesting. I'll give it 10 more seconds. And obviously, right, because this is a pretty big book, I do have to cut stuff, a lot of specifics out. Somebody asked a slightly off-topic question of why did China never conquer Korea? Well, they did. Twice, actually. We'll talk about it later when we get to Korea, actually. But the Chosun was invaded twice by the Qing dynasty. So they subjugated Korea twice. They actually had to invade Korea twice. But they don't they don't have the manpower to not even that. Not that they couldn't have occupied Korea, but the question was why? So just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something, or it's a good idea. Even the Manchurians, right, the Qing dynasty, it was like we just talked about, right? It's the richest dynasty in the history of the world. Why do they have to go to their north and invade a little peninsula and, spend 500,000 soldiers, a full-time army, to occupy it, when they're Confucian, they speak your language, and they send you tribute? Right? They already did subjugate them. That's kind of the point. But they didn't occupy them directly. No, we'll get to it. But no, in general, no, they didn't even have to do that, right? They defeated Korea in 2 wars, and then just made the Korean dynasty submit to them, and they left. Occupation never makes money. That's the spoiler, everybody. If you have to occupy anyone, it's not profitable, it's not good, they don't like you, right? It ends, if you Afghanistan something, it doesn't end well. Why do I make that joke? Think about it. Exactly. Somebody says, oh, Machiavelli. Yes, exactly, right? You only have a couple choices if you're going to occupy a province on the border of your empire, and you're not going to live there, and you're not going to have colonies, and you're not going to move an army there. Or, you could wipe them all out, but why would you wipe them out when you can leave them to give you prestige, right? That's what the Chinese model is. So the Chinese had a lot of places that were in their kind of satellite. They were satellites, but they didn't conquer them necessarily. Even in the book, we heard the story of, Central Asian Muslim kind of nomadic kingdoms would send tributes to the Emperor of China. Why would they do that? It's not because it's respect, right? They knew it was their big neighbor. They wanted to trade with China. They wanted China to not send armies after them. So, sending one representative every couple of years is a cheap way to not fight a war. And we'll get to the Korean perspective of all of this when we get to Korea, I promise. We will definitely talk about it. All right, great questions, everybody. Okay, let's keep going. Even a little off topic, it's super fun. And all this the longer we go in class, the more all of this will intertwine. Okay, Edge of the World. Now we get to switch our narrative a little bit to some of the people who kind of participated in this story. So, Canton, switching our focus kind of back to the British, generally speaking, Canton avoided the uprisings directly, but not corruption. Canton is still famously corrupt, and it's still famously aggravating to the Europeans. Now, we get a little bit more about how the corruption worked, but basically, to trade in Canton, you had to trade with a Han merchant. And what was a Han merchant? A Han merchant was a merchant picked by the commissar, the government officer running trade in Canton, and then that trader, you had to do every single dealing with them. You couldn't park in the port if they didn't authorize it. You had to buy all your food from them. You had to rent your land from them. So there was a lot of risk and a lot of profit, and they controlled everything, which was great. But the Chinese government also held them over a barrel. How? Well, they couldn't even quit. Imagine you can't quit your job. And this will, traditional Asia, this will make a lot more sense to understand kind of early modern Asia. Most of the time, you didn't get to pick your social position. And in this case, these Han merchants could get really rich or lose everything. Many of them went bankrupt, because they basically had to guarantee delivery of, a bunch of tea throughout all of China in the middle of a giant civil war. It's what if you have, a trade convoy and the rebels or the corrupt government ministers steal all your trade? you go bankrupt and you lose your position. So, but these guys could not get a break. So it was very risky, even though they had a lot of profit. They controlled everything, but they also regularly got their wealth appropriated by the government all the time. Like, hey, we need a donation for rebellion relief. I heard you're all going to donate. And you just do it. You don't have a choice. Like, the guy controls your livelihood. What are you going to do? Say no? And then the Hoppo, who was the guy in charge of all these merchants, was the only government minister who really controlled trade. Wildly unpopular. Everybody disliked him. The Europeans didn't like him. The emperor didn't like him. The local traders didn't like him. The local Confucians didn't like him. They even wrote fiction about evil Hoppo, like it was in the book. Like, nobody liked this guy. So this is a rough situation for the Europeans, but also for the Hong merchants. Now, we start to get to some of the European problems. Oh, what does this mean? Well, first, this is interesting too, you kind of see the world is much more connected than we used to think it is. In 1793, this is the year of the emissary, by the way, there's a Jacobin rebellion in France. And initially people are like, oh, isn't this great? And then the French just murder everybody. They murder all the rebellion, they murder all their nobility, they try to kill all the Catholics. And then they systematically try to murder the rest of Europe. And they get pretty close. This started a worldwide naval battle and wars that lasted for the next 20 years, mostly between the French and the British. Why? Everybody else got conquered by the French. It's not even a joke. Like, every substantial power fought France in the next 20 years. So if you remember, we're talking about trade across the world. This suddenly becomes a big issue, right? The British have to protect their trade. The French then all of a sudden have influence, as we talked about in this chapter, right? They suddenly control Portugal. Like, how come the Portuguese allied with the French? Because the French literally invaded Spain and Portugal with a giant army and defeated them, and then made puppet kings. So this became a huge issue. So this means there was a change in relationships everywhere. And some of the smaller ones that are interesting, like the Americans replaced the French in Canton. Oh, so we officially had Americans enter our scene for the first time. And then we started to get our first problem with Macau in 1801, 1802. What happens? The French are worried, or the British are worried the French will force the Portuguese to exclude them. So the French send a fleet, or the British in India send a big warship fleet to try to threaten the Chinese. It doesn't work, but it's the first kind of military-on-military standoff in our story. So basically the Chinese don't concede anything and try to starve them out. And eventually the British just give in and go away. So the Chinese are like, hey, all we have to do is threaten them and saber rattle and we'll win. It works this time anyway. So there's more tensions now just in the world, too. So China's having all these rebellions, and then across the West, rebellions are starting, right? Is this the only rebellion that happened this time period? Huh. I mean, think about it, folks. This is within 20 years of the American Revolution, right? 20 or 30 years of the American Revolution. We have all the South American revolutions happen in the next 20. We have the French Revolution. Now China's full of rebellion and revolution. I mean, this is welcome to the 19th century. So we're starting to get this dynamic coming together where there's a lot more conflict in the world. And it's international conflict, right? We always like to think like the World War I was the first world war. But the Napoleonic War were huge world wars. Any questions? And I already see one. Somebody says, are you trying to say there's a single world power calling the shots? No, but what I am saying that things in humanity tend to happen in clumps. That is for sure. I'm more of a cyclical nature of history kind of guy. So when things start to collapse, they seem to be collapsing everywhere. Somebody said, did the French trade with the Chinese in Canton? If not, why do they have relations? Yes, the French had a small trade contingent in Canton until the Napoleonic Wars, and then they lost it, and the Americans got it, but they'll get it back by the time of the Opium Wars. But we're not there yet. But for now, yes, the French did have trade relations, but they lost it. Because they just couldn't, they didn't have a fleet to compete with the British. Somebody said, did Britain still pay tribute to China during this time? Well, Britain didn't pay tribute, right? But they, as we've already talked about, they basically made each other rich. So the Canton trade funded the Chinese imperial government. And now we learn, during this problem, the Canton trade funds the British Napoleonic War effort. I think it was 2/3 of the British government revenue came from one city in China. So that's why this problem with Macau was not allowed to boil over yet, because the government of England knew they couldn't afford to lose it. I mean, the Chinese also knew they couldn't afford to lose it either, because they were in the middle of a civil war now. Right? They had this giant uprising, they couldn't rebel, and they went broke. So now they really need to trade with Europeans. But they also don't want to concede anything either, because they're not idiots, right? Think about it. There's still mostly Chinese living in Macau, for example, right? They can ask the Portuguese, like, what's going on in Europe? Oh, you know, Napoleon conquered everything. Oh, does Napoleon like the British? Oh, no, they're enemies. Huh, interesting. Right? Like, the Chinese had this data. They weren't dumb. They kind of had a feeling what was going on. Alright, let's keep going. Now we get, again, the part that people hopefully like about Platt. We go back down to the personal stories again. And we go back to our George Stanton. Now, we get the story of the dad, who's George Stanton Sr. Well, he's not really a senior because he has a different name. But George Stanton the Elder, who... The whole reason he went on the McCartney mission is he hoped to become the ambassador to China. And he actually gave up a rich job being in Canton instead, which means he went home completely broken, and then had a stroke, and then said something like, "Son, you must carry on the family legacy. If you do not do it, we will all be embarrassed." And then we have a son, funny enough, also named George Stanton. So from now on, when we say George Stanton, we mean the son, not the dad. His dad says, "Son, if you do not want to disappoint me, I'm going to send you back to Canton." And he's like, "But Daddy, I hate Canton. I do not want to go." And the dad is like, "You must go and be rich, son, and bring the money back." So, okay, Dad. And by the way, he's only 18, so my making him sound like a kid is not fully far off. So his dad gets his son, he even gets him a job this time. He's not poor James Flint, right? He doesn't have to be a vagrant. He gets him a job, a horrible job. I think it's a writer. Like, he's a copy machine, basically, human copy machine. And he puts him on a boat. And his dad, before they left, his dad was smart. His dad hired 2 Chinese tutors for his son. So the whole way back to England, and his whole time in England after the embassy, and his whole time back, he has Chinese help. So I think they're both Roman Catholic. So they speak Latin and Chinese, and then they only speak Chinese together. So Stanton is serious. He learns Chinese academically, too, by the way. He receives the worst job when he gets there, right? He's a copy editor who's paid nothing, but there's some possibility of advancement, which is nice. Now, he has 3 goals when he goes. Here's his big 3 goals. To earn promotion, which means he can get paid a lot and leave forever. Find alternative income. And as we find out, generally the 2 ways you would do this is you have a friend in India who helps you trade between India and Canton, which is the only legal trade for British people to do. Or, if you had lots of cash, you could loan money to the Hong merchants. He didn't have any money, though, and he didn't have any friends at all, actually, but not in India either. And finally he thought, I need to find a way to use my Chinese, which was the hardest of the 3. Eventually, though, he does find a way. Now, when he's there, everybody tells him studying a foreign language is stupid. Why would you ever do that? And I'm laughing because I'm sure more than one person here has gotten that spiel from somebody in their family. Right? "Mommy, I'm going to college. I am going to study Japanese." Then they say, "That's dumb, Jimmy. You should learn plumbing." Maybe you should have, but I mean, at least one person laughed. Good. I'm happy that happened to some of you too. So, but that's what everybody told poor Georgie here. He was, they're like, "That's dumb, George. Just do your job and get rich." So, lucky for him, actually, unluckily, there was a British Navy vessel in Canton that was getting, they claim, robbed by a bunch of Chinese guys. At night, a bunch of Chinese guys snuck up and tried to steal their anchor to sell it, because it's metal, right? And And they shot him and killed like they wounded 3 of these Chinese guys. So then the Chinese courts wanted to like hand over the British right now. We're going to execute them for attempted murder. And normally the merchants would just surrender. They gave the Chinese whatever the heck they wanted. But the Navy was like, hey, screw you, we're not doing it. And then they found out that Stanton existed. And he went to court, actually, and defended these guys. And he actually managed to get them off. So suddenly everybody said, like, wow, this is useful. And we have our second really standoff between the Navy and the Chinese government, so we're starting to see this tension, right? But also, Stanton figured out that the Chinese, the law code made by our last emperor, he figured out there is even a legal code. So like, wait, there's a legal code? Wait, there's a legal code that's 144 books? Yes. Wow. So suddenly Stanton had a little bit of a motivation. He's like, wow, this is a totally different world. He did not expect it, right? And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? How would you know that the Chinese had a legal code? They didn't care to tell the Europeans, right? They're like, by the way, we have an extensive formalized legal code. Would you like a copy of the book? Qianlong, by the way, made the formalized Qin legal code into one big document. So we start to get this interaction, right? Not only we get the kind of military interaction or the political, right, that conflict between the Navy and the Chinese government, but we start to get that personal interaction where for the first time, a British trader who's working for the company interacted with a Chinese government minister not using the merchants. So that's these are both big changes. One, you could argue, is going to cause more tension, right, the military, but the other one is actually a big, communication-wise, that's a big change. Now, of course, it made the Chinese merchants nervous, but we start to get to see more behind the veil from the European perspective. Now, interesting enough, I should have said allowed to interpret, but he was an approved interpreter. The Chinese had no problem with Stanton, doing the interpreting during this court case, and they asked him a lot of questions on procedure and clarity, and he actually did a great job. And after this, he did a good enough job. The East India Company, the company he's working for, right? They have the exclusive trade rights. They sponsored his study, and they even bought him the Qing legal code, and he started to translate it. And he figured out he'd been learning the wrong kind of Chinese. So he's slowly shifting over to Mandarin, not Cantonese. Now, his father dies in 1802, which he basically gets bereavement leave. He gets to return to England for 2 years. Now, interesting, when he gets there, he's now the only Chinese scholar in the country. So he receives Lord Macartney's patronage. He gets a lot of intellectual societies that make him a member. So he meets a lot of very influential lord, and he becomes a sir, like a lord. So after his dad dies, he actually gets estates and becomes a baron. So this is at the same time while he has now more intellectual chops too. And then in 1807 he returns, again hating it. He realizes he has to do it, right? But he's not rich enough to quit yet. So it's like, I gotta go back, and I'm the only one who can do it. And now they actually don't think my language skills are as useless. But part of his journey, he starts to look for other people to share the Chinese load with. Because if he's the only European, the only Brit who speaks Chinese, they'll never let him go, right? He can never leave again. It's like, I would like to go home sometimes. So let's find other people to help out. Now, our 2 others, which we are going to meet today, is Thomas Manning and Robert Morrison. And we'll get into who they are. But I'll answer some questions first. Any questions so far? I'll give it about 30 seconds. I'm glad people resonated with poor George Stanton, right? They had also had that experience of somebody telling them, don't waste your life, Jimmy. To be fair to George, his dad was very supportive. It's just everybody else wasn't. Alright, no questions. Let's keep going. We're a little behind today, but I'm okay with that. We had a good discussion. Alright, so, as we already kind of talked about, but obviously, the Napoleonic War squeezed the British government. And then it put pressure on the East India Company. Why? Well, going to war for 25 years is expensive. And what's more expensive than that? Going to war on the entire globe is even more expensive. Now, if you don't know anything about that, you're like, what do you mean, Professor Zeiser? Well, by the 1810s, France controlled all of continental Europe, which means they controlled all those nations' fleets. So now England has to fight all of continental Europe by itself. And if you don't know anything about colonialism, by 1800, right, most of the European nations have extensive colonies elsewhere, like, you know, North and South America, a lot of parts of Africa, but not very much of Africa yet. You know, North America, obviously, all the islands in the Pacific, Caribbean, right? So they have to compete over the entire world for 20 years. So this led to the East India Company getting squeezed. How? Well, the tea tax, which we learned about before, which went from 100% to 12%, got increased. How much? Well, in 1802 it was made 50%, and by 1806 it was 96%. So this is desperation, right? Like, the British government is broke. And by the way, if you want to know how expensive this war was, the United Kingdom government is still paying interest on Napoleonic debt today. If you've ever wanted to know why you shouldn't take debt, that's why. The problem with debt is the companies never want you to pay it back. Right? It's the same way credit card companies make their money. You never paying. That's how they make money. All right. Now, the majority of the company income came from China. We already talked about this. Not India. India lost money. They had to have a standing army. The East India Company had an army in India because they just kept getting forced into wars by their allies. So India just cost them a bunch of money. And then that's compared to China. Just the Canton trade made 2/3 of the income of the East India Company. So it is the whole point of this company to exist at this point. And then it's 1/10 of all British government income. So the tax on tea, just the tax on tea, was 10% of government revenue. So now all of a sudden, the level of interest has exploded, right? Why should we care about this? It's now exploded. And I feel like I skipped those two poor Japs. We'll go back to them in a second. But yeah, so now we're starting to see the reach here, right? And then we have another conflict. In 1808, there's a second Macau conflict, where there's the threat that the French are going to send an army to hold Macau. And this one, it's flipped, actually. Last time, the Navy wanted to go to war, and the traders, the supercargoes, wanted peace. This time, the supercargoes want conflict. And the Navy Admiral, Dury, I think he might have been a captain, he kept his head and did not go to war. And the Chinese side made zero compromises. They did not care about the British at all. And this time the British actually didn't just threaten. The British Marines actually invaded and took all the forts. So the Chinese were especially pissed. So they gave them nothing. In the end, there was no conflict. And then there was different reactions of the British English and then the Chinese. The Chinese reaction was, everybody got fired. The British reaction was just generally, let's not do that again. All right. And I realized I actually need to go back really quick. And it's perfectly amount of time. We'll go back. But any questions about this? I don't think we're going to get to sea and land today. I need to cover Thomas Manning and Morrison a little bit. And then they'll come back, but I want to give them their introduction. Any questions about kind of the politics around this? So you're starting to see the pressure increasing, right? So it's important now more to England, and we're starting to get military and political, altercations, which have started. So, welcome. Okay, I don't see any questions popping up. I skipped these poor gentlemen. I should. These are the two hypothetical replacements who show up to help George Stanton. So first, we have Thomas Manning, who's a British. He studied math at Cambridge, never took his tests. I already like this guy. He had many setbacks in his life, but after the McCartney mission, he got super into reading China commentary and just knew he had to go there to explore. And he had a plan to sneak to China. He wanted to go to Russia and sneak into China. I love this guy. He's great. But instead, he uses connections to get into Canton to be a medical, because when he couldn't go, he got fooled like 2 or 3 times. He went to medical school, and then eventually he got his connections in the company to get him to be a medical officer in Canton. And as soon as he got there, he's like, dude, Stanton, you got to teach me, man. So now we have one guy who's very curious to learn Chinese, mostly to sneak into China and learn about it. He will do it eventually. So we got one trainee. The second one we get is we have Morrison, who is a slightly different person. Robert Morrison is from London, but this guy is a Protestant missionary. And he's the first Protestant missionary to China ever. And he couldn't get any passage from England. Basically, they're like, yeah, no missionaries are going to mess with trade, no thanks. So he had to find his way over to America, and then the Americans actually sponsored him to get him to China. And when he got there, he was pretty badly mistreated because the British didn't want him around, so he ended up living with the Americans, who are now there. And he also was able to kind of take up patronage with George Stanton. So these are our 2 more characters who will enter our fray, and they will become relevant later. We are going to learn more about them. But now we have 2 more people who are now interested in learning more Chinese. Now, for different reasons, obviously. So, Morrison wants to basically do, proselytize, translate the Bible, spread it, and originally he can't get any patronage, but eventually the supercargo, actually the guy who does this, the guy in charge of the 1808 Macau conflict, he patronizes, aka sponsors, Morrison. Manning has a paid job. He doesn't need sponsorship. But between the 2 of them, they start to study with Stanton. So we're starting to build up a kind of core of people who are trying to be literate in Chinese. And that's kind of this, because think about it, it went from 0 to 1 to 3. That's a 300% increase, man. That's great. And Stanton's super jazzed, even though he's a little bit nervous. Manning is, mercurial would be the word I'd use for him, right? He might disappear at any time, and Morrison has different goals, right? He doesn't care about trade or law. He wants to proselytize. So, but these guys will come back the whole story. Don't worry. That's one reason I didn't want to skip them. So, all right. Any questions about either of these slides or those men before we call it? Now is the time. I'll give us about a minute if you have questions. Alright, I don't see any questions yet. So today's a bit of a short one because our discussion went long, which I'm never going to complain about. For next class, we're going to do chapters 4 and 5, so that'll be Monday. So Sea and Land and the one after that. Hold on, I can just look at my notes. Points of entry, oh yeah. So somebody asked a question, why was learning a foreign language during this period so looked down upon? Because the trade and other priorities? Well, think about it. There's like 20 British people ever living in China. 20 ever. So the kind of utility of Chinese was still super small, right? Like there wasn't a job for it. Does that make sense? Like that's why studying it didn't make sense. Like they would have said like study French or Latin or Spanish, right? So the kind of usefulness of it seemed low, which at the time I think is fair. It was kind of low. But then, the political conflict and the trade linked to the politics, forced all of this to become more important. So Stanton just had good timing, right? So he had good timing, good connections, etc. Flint had none of these things. Poor Flint was just a little too early and a little too low class. But that's a good question. Any other questions? We seem good. All right, folks. I'm going to call it there because class is almost over. So I'll come send us off in Discord for the community members watching. Thank you very much. Just random people. We'll be back next Monday, and we'll keep going, talking about China. It'll be great. Until then, have a great week. I'll see you all later.